The morning wind cut like a knife as it rolled across the open range, brushing low over frost-stiffened grasses and tugging at Ezekiel Ward's long wool coat. The sun was just beginning to split the horizon, casting a pale orange hue that softened the brutal, endless stretch of land he called home. It had been 12 winters since Clara died, 12 long, bitter years of silence, whiskey, and work. He hadn't spoken to anyone in 3. His voice, like his joy, had grown thin from lack of use. Most days, he didn't even talk to his horse. And yet, even in his solitude, he was a man of ritual. Every morning, without fail, he saddled his old bay gelding, Jasper, and rode the same trail that looped out toward the ridge and back along the abandoned railway line. The tracks hadn't seen a train in over a decade. Ever since the mining town to the north dried up and was swallowed by the sandbutt, they were still solid in the earth. A memory carved in steel and rust. Clara used to love walking there. She said the tracks were like a path straight through time, a road that went both forward and back, depending on where your heart was headed. Ezekiel hadn't walked the tracks since the day he buried her, but that morning, God help him, something pulled at him. A tremor in the wind, maybe, or a pressure behind his ribs. It wasn't grief. He'd long since become numb to that. It was something different, like the air had shifted, like time itself was holding its breath. And then, from the stillness, a sound broke across the cold quiet, then high-pitched, almost drowned by the wind. A cry. At first, he thought it was a hawk, the kind that circled the ridge at daybreak, looking for field mice. But as he slowed Jasper and tilted his head, the sound came again. Louder this time, short, desperate, the unmistakable wail of a baby. Ezekiel's blood froze. He dismounted with more speed than grace, his knees protesting after years of riding and injury. The cry came again, this time from the ditch that ran alongside the tracks. Hidden beneath a cluster of frost-laced tumbleweeds, he stepped cautiously, one hand hovering over the revolver on his belt, the other brushing the weeds aside like lifting the veil of a grave. And then he saw it, a bundle, a blanket filthy threadbare, and tied loosely with a strip of leather lay tucked between the gravel and weeds. It moved slightly, twitching with every shriek. Ezekiel dropped to his knees, heart thudding, hands shaking as he untied the knot and peeled back the stiff fabric. Inside was a baby, red-cheeked, squinting in the cold light. Alive, the child couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, thin, blue-lipped, shivering, eyes squeezed shut in protest of the morning chill. Ezekiel didn't realize he'd stopped breathing until the infant gasped again, and that jolted him back into motion. He yanked off his gloves, picked the baby up, and pressed it close to his chest, wrapping the coat around them both. That was when he saw it, dangling around the baby's tiny neck, held by a leather cord that had been tied in a knot too tight for such a small child, was a rusted silver locket, oval-shaped, with a crooked hinge and a deep scratch down one side. Ezekiel stared. It couldn't be. He reached for the chain with trembling fingers, heart hammering so loud he could hear it in his ears. He had held that locket once, held it 1,000 times, turning it between calloused fingers like a prayer stone, like a rosary. He had placed it around Clara's neck the night before she died, fastened it himself after she fell asleep beside the fire, cheeks flushed from fever. He remembered the way it shimmered against her skin in the low lamplight. She hadn't taken it off since the day he gave it to her on their wedding night. It was hers. He'd buried it with her. He'd made sure of it. He remembered opening her stiff fingers and placing the locket in her hands before they closed the coffin. He remembered the clink it made as it settled against the wood. That locket had gone into the earth with his wife, so how in God's name was it here? On a baby? A baby left to die by the tracks. His vision swam. The wind howled through the reeds like a woman's scream. The child whimpered again, a weak sound that sliced through the haze and grounded him. No time to think. He pulled the child closer, turned back toward Jasper, and mounted awkwardly with the baby cradled in one arm. The ride home was a blur, mess of dust and memory and questions he didn't dare form into words. The cabin was cold when he arrived. He burst through the door like a man fleeing from a nightmare, kicked it shut behind him, and went straight to the hearth. He laid the baby on a pile of old wool blankets and lit the fire with shaking hands. The flint slipped twice. The third time, flame roared to life and cast flickering light across the room. Everything looked the same, yet everything had changed. The wooden cradle still sat in the corner, untouched for over a decade. Clara had made it by hand, carving wildflowers into the headboard while humming lullabies to a child that never came. They had tried for years, and when Clara grew ill and the doctor said there was no chance of surviving childbirth, they had buried the dream along with their hope. Or so Ezekiel had believed. He stared down at the child. The baby had stopped crying now. It blinked slowly in the firelight, as if trying to understand where it had landed. The locket glinted against its neck. Ezekiel knelt beside it, lifted the locket gently, and opened it with the practiced flick of his thumb. The inside was exactly as he remembered. On one side, a miniature photograph of Clara, eyes bright, lips curled in that soft, amused smile she used to wear when she caught him looking at her. On the other, a lock of her hair, still golden, still intact. His breath caught. He felt like he was falling through time. 12 years ago, he had buried that locket. He had stood at her grave until the sky turned black and the earth froze. He had spent the following decade convinced that the last piece of her was gone. But it wasn't. It had returned, wrapped around the neck of a child he'd never seen. Who left her? Why here? Why now? And how did she have Clara's locket? The questions built like thunder behind his eyes. He wanted to scream, to rage, but he did neither. Instead, he lifted the baby into his arms again, wrapped it in the blankets, and sat in the rocking chair by the fire. Outside, the wind howled like it had something to say. Inside, Ezekiel rocked slowly, staring at the locket, then the fire, then the child, and he whispered Clara's name for the first time in years. The fire crackled gently as dawn gave way to a dull morning light, sliding in through the chinks in the shutters. Ezekiel Ward hadn't moved from the rocking chair all night. The baby lay still against his chest, finally sleeping after a long bout of fussing, and the locket's an impossible locket rested cold against his rough palm. He turned it over again and again, like a coin he couldn't make sense of, as if repetition would suddenly reveal some logic that might make this nightmare a dream, or at least explain how it had come to be here. Wrapped around the neck of a child left to die by the railroad tracks. He hadn't opened the door to the past in years, but the child had flung it open with one cry. The cabin around him looked like a forgotten shrine. Dust covered most of it, including the mantel where Clara's photograph still sat in its small wooden frame. The image was grainy and fading, but her expression hadn't changed. The quiet, knowing smile she always wore when she had secrets. And Clara had always had secrets. Little ones, mostly stories about where she'd grown up, things she never quite told in full. Nothing that ever made Ezekiel question her love for him. But now, sitting there with a baby in his arms and her locket in his hand, every shadow from the past took on a new shape. He rose slowly, joints stiff, and carried the child into the small back room where Clara's belongings still lived in silence. He hadn't touched any of it. Couldn't bring himself to. Her shawl still hung on the back of the door, her boots by the wall. Her sewing kit lay half open on the table, thread tangled, like a memory that had never been finished. He placed the baby on the bed, then retrieved the shawl and wrapped it around the child with more tenderness than he thought remained in him. It smelled of dried lavender and pine smoke, just like she used to. As he looked at the child, the locket glinting faintly from the folds of fabric, a thought struck him cold. What if this child wasn't left here by accident? What if someone had brought her specifically to him? His hands tightened on the shawl. No one knew where he lived anymore. He hadn't seen another soul in 3 winters, not since he stopped trading in town and started growing or hunting everything himself. So whoever left the baby knew exactly where to find him and what the necklace would mean. That wasn't chance. It was a message, a cruel one. He tried to shake the thought loose, but it stuck like a thorn under his skin. He needed answers. He sat at Clara's old desk and opened the drawer that hadn't been touched in over a decade. There, tucked beneath a stack of brittle letters, was her diary. He almost didn't pick it up, almost left it there to rot in peace. But something in him, same instinct that had drawn him to the railroad that morning, pushed him forward. He opened the leather-bound cover and began to read. The entries were dated, and most of them were written in Clara's neat, flowing script letters that curved like her voice used to. At first, they were the sort of things he expected. Musings about the ranch, notes about the weather, sketches of flowers she wanted to plant, meals she'd planned for the week. But around the later pages, just months before she died, the tone began to shift. The handwriting wavered. The thoughts grew fragmented. One entry stopped his breath. I haven't told Ezekiel. I don't think I can. Not yet. Not until I know. For sure, it's safe. If what they say is true, if the child is in danger, I'd rather him hate me than lose both of us. He read it 3 times. Then turned the page. They're coming. I heard them last night outside the house. I think they know. I begged Martha to say nothing, but she saw the bruises. She suspects something. God forgive me. I should have told Zeke, but it's too late now. Martha. That name rang like a bell in his memory. Martha Kessler, Clara's midwife, the one who'd tended to her through fevers, migraines, the sleepless nights, the one who sat beside Clara's deathbed when Ezekiel couldn't face the end, the last person who'd truly known his wife. He rose from the desk like a man emerging from a trance. Martha lived in town, or had, at least. It had been years since he stepped foot there, but he needed the truth. Whatever had happened 12 years ago had been buried not only beneath Clara's grave, but also under a web of secrets she'd never dared share. And now, a child had arrived, wearing that secret around her neck. Ezekiel packed a satchel with supplies, a blanket for the baby, a bottle of milk he had to warm on the stove, and Clara's locket, which he wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked into his coat pocket. Then he paused. His eyes drifted to the rifle above the hearth. Something in his gut whispered danger. He ignored it at first, but as his hand hesitated over the latch, that whisper became a warning. He took the rifle down. Outside, the wind had stilled. The sky was the soft, watery gray of early spring. He saddled Jasper, swaddled the baby close to his chest, and rode toward town, award answers. The child didn't cry once during the journey, as though it knew, somehow, that the time for tears had passed. She merely blinked up at him now and then, her face too calm for someone so small. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the outskirts of the town of Granger's Hollow. Once a thriving mining settlement, now it was a place people only passed through. The saloon leaned like a drunkard. The general store hadn't restocked in years, but the old church still stood, and across from it was the weather-beaten house where Martha Kessler had lived her entire life. He dismounted, knocked once, then twice. No answer. He knocked again, louder footsteps, then the door opened, creaking like it had arthritis. Martha stood behind it, older than he remembered, gray-haired and pale as dust, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. They locked onto his aunt, then dropped to the baby in his arms. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh Lord, help us," she whispered. "She's come back." Ezekiel stepped inside without a word. Martha closed the door behind them and led him into the parlor. He sat in the same worn chair he had years ago, after Clara's funeral. He remembered the tea she served him, the way she wept more than he could, but now, the silence was different, heavy with revelation. He unwrapped the baby slowly and showed her the locket. Martha's face went white. "I buried that locket with Clara," Ezekiel said. "I placed it in her hands myself." Martha didn't speak for a long moment. Then she sat across from him, folded her hands in her lap, and nodded. "She wasn't in the coffin." Ezekiel, his breath caught. "What?" "I switched her out," Martha said quietly. "I helped Clara escape." Ezekiel felt the breath rush out of him, like someone had struck him in the gut. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. It was as if the room had shifted beneath him. The floor, the walls, the ceiling, they all remained. Yet everything felt unfamiliar, like a house built on lies instead of timber. What did you just say?" he asked, voice hoarse. Martha Kessler, who had always been a woman of unflinching poise, looked down at her hands now, as if they bore some ancient stain. Her fingers trembled slightly as she folded them, perhaps ashamed, perhaps bracing herself. "I didn't lie to hurt you, Ezekiel," she said quietly. "I lied because your wife begged me to." He stared at her. "Clara was dying. She was sick, but not with what she told you," Martha replied, raising her eyes slowly to meet his. "She wasn't dying, not then. She was pregnant." The room seemed to tilt again. A pressure built in Ezekiel's chest. "Pregnant. She told you it was another fever, something she couldn't beat," Martha said. "And you believed her because you trusted her. But the truth was worse. She was hiding, protecting a secret that would have killed all three of you if it got out." He stood up, knocking his chair backward. The baby stirred in the shawl but didn't cry. He caught the edge of the table, trying to hold on to something solid. "Why would she lie to me?" he muttered. "We loved each other. There were no secrets." Martha sighed, her voice breaking. "There were, Ezekiel. You just didn't want to see them." She stood slowly and crossed to an old sideboard where a locked drawer sat. From a pocket in her skirt, she produced a small brass key, inserted it, and withdrew a stack of yellowing letters tied in ribbon. She brought them to him like a bundle of dynamite. "These are from Clara. She sent them to me over the years. I didn't know if I should burn them or deliver them. I chose to protect her wishes. But now," Martha glanced at the child, "now the time for secrets is over." He took the letters like they might burn his hands. His fingers fumbled with the knot in the ribbon, and when it gave way, the scent of old paper and lavender wafted up Clara's scent. His chest clenched. The first letter was dated only 2 weeks after her supposed death. "Dear Martha, if you're reading this, it means we made it through the first stage. I'm writing from across the border. The place is quiet, hot, remote. The baby is due soon. I can't stop thinking about Zico. He looked when I kissed him for the last time, how I almost told him everything. But I knew if I did, he'd come after us. He'd never believe what I'd done was right. That's the curse of love, isn't it? Sometimes it protects, sometimes it blinds. I'm scared, but I'm more scared for the child, for the life they'll have if I fail." Ezekiel sat down again. His hands were shaking now, his vision blurring. He read through more letters, page after page, of Clara's handwriting, each one revealing a piece of a life she had lived without him. The story that emerged was unthinkable. Clara had learned something dangerous about a powerful landowner and railroad magnate named Silas Greaves. Silas had overseen the purchase of vast tracts of land near Granger's Hollow. But Clara, who often volunteered to help displaced women and children, had stumbled upon documents that suggested Silas was using child labor brought across the border, orphans, mostly smuggled through rail carts in the dead of night and sold into servitude on remote homesteads. She'd told Martha, and together, they tried to expose him. But Greaves had power in every corner, sheriffs, lawyers, even some ministers. When Clara confronted him directly, he threatened her, said he'd ruin Ezekiel, said he'd put a bullet in her husband's head and make it look like a drunken accident. And then Clara learned. She was pregnant. Terrified that the child would be used as leverage or worse, she hatched a desperate plan to disappear, to fake her death with Martha's help and start over somewhere far away. She chose the day when her illness seemed to peak. Martha brewed a concoction that would mimic death-like symptoms: stillness, shallow breath, faint pulse. Ezekiel, overwhelmed with grief, never thought to question the silence of the body laid in the coffin. Clara was buried with her locket, her only link to home. But the next night, Martha returned to the grave, dug her out before dawn, and smuggled her across the state line. "It nearly killed me," Martha said now, watching Ezekiel read. "I knew you'd be destroyed, but Clara begged me, and when I saw how frightened she was, I believed her." Ezekiel was silent. The letters slipped from his lap and scattered on the floor like leaves in a storm. He finally looked up. "She lived all this time?" Martha nodded. "And the baby?" "She had a daughter. Named her Evelyn. Said it reminded her of hope." He looked down at the child in his arms. Her eyes opened, dark salamander locked with his. "Is this her?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Martha hesitated, then nodded. "That's Evelyn's daughter. Clara's granddaughter." "Your granddaughter, Ezekiel." The words echoed in his skull like a church bell struck too hard. "Granddaughter." His hands trembled as he clutched the child closer. "What happened to Clara, to Evelyn?" Martha's face grew grave. "I don't know everything, but from the last letter, something had gone wrong. Evelyn had grown up strong, fierce, like Clara. She started asking questions about her mother's past, about Granger's Hollow, about the man who made Clara run. Greaves' son, Thomas, inherited his father's cruelty and ambition. Evelyn crossed paths with him. There was an accident or something worse. I never got another letter after that." Ezekiel rose, every movement aching with new weight. "You think Thomas did something to them?" Martha nodded slowly. "And if this baby ended up on your land with Clara's locket, it wasn't an accident. Someone wanted her safe. Someone knew she belonged here." A fire reignited in Ezekiel's chest. All these years, he'd buried his grief beneath silence, swallowed the pain of Clara's death like poison, and waited for the end. But now he had something to live for. A child, a granddaughter, a legacy he never knew existed. He looked down at the baby, who reached a tiny hand toward the locket. Her fingers curled around it instinctively. Martha stood slowly. "You'll need to be careful, Ezekiel. If Greaves or his men learn that this child is alive, and that she's connected to Clara, they won't rest. That family doesn't leave threads hanging." He nodded. "Then I won't be a thread. I'll be a thorn." Outside, the sky had shifted from gray to steel blue. Clouds rolled like bruises across the horizon. Trouble was coming, he could feel it, but so was purpose. For the first time in years, Ezekiel Ward had a reason to fight. "I'm going to find out what happened to Clara," he said, "and Evelyn. If they're alive, I'll bring them home. If they're not," his voice trailed off, "I'll make sure those responsible remember their names." Martha reached for his hand. "You'll need help." "I'm not the man I used to be," he said. "Maybe not," she said softly, "but you're the only one this child has. And Clara chose you for a reason." He wrapped the baby tighter in Clara's shawl and stepped out into the wind. A journey had begun, one that would carry him across borders, into danger, and through memories darker than any night on the range. But this time, he wasn't riding alone. The prairie stretched wide and endless before Ezekiel as he stepped out of Martha's parlor, the child swaddled to his chest in Clara's old shawl. The wind had picked up, flinging sand and grit into the air as if the land itself wanted to test his resolve. But Ezekiel Ward, long believed a ghost among the living, was no longer hollow. The warmth of a child's breath against his collarbone reminded him that blood still pulsed through his veins, and that Clara's fire, the very thing he had mourned all those years, was not extinguished. It had simply passed into smaller hands. He didn't return home. Instead, he headed straight to the old telegraph station, still operated by a hunched man named Polly Keene, whose hearing was as brittle as his handwriting. Ezekiel, quiet and severe as always, slid him a short note, scrawled in blocky letters. "Need information on Evelyn Ward, possibly last seen near El Presidio Crossing. Also, Thomas Greaves, whereabouts, current holdings. Send word to Granger's Hollow. Urgent." Polly looked up, confused. "You ain't sent a telegram since '89, Zeke." "Then, it's about damn time," Ezekiel said, and left. The ride south began at dawn. He packed light, a rifle, a pouch of coin, dried meat, and Clara's locket, which now hung around the baby's neck like an emblem of defiance. Martha had insisted he take her mare, faster than his old gelding, and a folded letter from Clara. She hadn't yet opened. "You'll know when it's time," she said as she slipped it into his coat. By the second day, the land turned unforgiving. Flat brush gave way to rocky ravines, where the sun punished from above and the night bit like a blade. Ezekiel rode with the baby wrapped tight against him. She didn't cry much, a quiet child, eyes always searching, as if she too sensed that every step took them deeper into a story that might not end well. On the third night, he made camp by a dry wash, lighting a small fire only long enough to warm milk for the baby. As she fed, he opened Clara's final letter, its seal still intact after all these years. Zeke, if you're reading this, then something's gone wrong. I never stopped loving you. Never. Not even when I lied. Not even when I ran. I did it because I knew what Greaves was capable of. What he'd do to you if he found out I had his son's documents. Yes, son? Silas wasn't just moving children. He was blackmailing lawmakers, rigging elections. I found proof, and I was going to give it to a reporter in El Presidio. If Evelyn's grown up and following my trail, then tell her she's braver than I ever was. But protect her, Zeke. If not for me, then for the world. We wanted for her. Love, Clara. Ezekiel folded the letter with shaking hands. Silas Greaves hadn't just been a tyrant, he'd been a king, and Clara, in her quiet fury, had tried to bring his empire down. By the time Ezekiel reached El Presidio, he looked nothing like the rancher who once buried a coffin with nothing but dust inside. His eyes burned like coal, and his silence had hardened into something sharp. He left the baby with an elderly nurse at a mission orphanage just for a day. He promised, and headed into the town's underbelly. It didn't take long to find someone who remembered Evelyn. She used to work at the paper mill, a vendor told him, then started digging into local elections. Disappeared a month after asking about the Greaves family. Never came back for her final paycheck. Ezekiel followed the breadcrumbs, visiting the mill, the local records office, even the graveyard. No body, no record of death. But whispers, always whispers. She was last seen talking to a man in a silver coat. That's what they say. Drove a buggy with Greaves Ranch branding. The more Ezekiel dug, the clearer it became. Evelyn had become a threat to the dynasty her grandmother once challenged. And Thomas Greaves had handled it the way men like him always did. Ezekiel left El Presidio by nightfall. His destination, Greaves Ranch. The journey west was treacherous. Rivers were low and bridges washed out from last season's floods. Twice he was stopped by hired men asking too many questions. Once, a bullet sang past his shoulder. He didn't fire back, not yet. He reached the edge of Greaves territory by week's end. The ranch house stood like a fortress, white stone, wraparound porch, armed guards, a dozen horses in the stable. He didn't approach through the road. He circled through the mesquite and crept in at dusk, reaching the back pasture where an old hand he'd once worked with, Jonah Gray, now herded sheep. Jonah looked up from his perch on the fence. Zeke Ward, damn ghost, heard you died of loneliness. Almost did, Ezekiel replied, need your help. Jonah narrowed his eyes. This about the girl Thomas had locked in the cellar last month. Ezekiel's blood froze. What girl? Dark-haired, eyes like a storm, said she had proof of something. Thomas flew into a rage, locked her up for a week. Then one night, she was gone. No one saw her leave. Some say well, you know how his father used to handle problems. Ezekiel gritted his teeth. I need to get inside. Tonight, Jonah nodded. Then let's make some ghosts. Together, they crept through the outbuildings until they reached the root cellar, one the Greaves family used for storage. Inside, Ezekiel found signs of habitation. A cot, a torn scarf, a half-burned notebook. He flipped through the pages. Evelyn's handwriting, names, dates, maps, a network of corruption stretching from the county seat to the capital. She'd been planning to go public. She was going to finish what Clara started. He whispered. Just then, footsteps thudded above. Jonah hissed and pulled him behind a stack of crates as Thomas Greaves himself descended the wooden stairs. Broad-shouldered, well-fed, and cloaked in arrogance. He carried a lantern and a pistol. I told you I'd handle it. He barked into thin air, speaking to someone above. If anyone comes sniffing, they'll get the same hole she did. Then he paused. The baby's locket, which Ezekiel had tucked into his vest, slipped free and caught the lantern's light, casting a glint onto the far wall. Thomas turned. Who's there? Ezekiel stepped out. Clara Ward sends her regards. Thomas blinked, confused. Then, realization dawned and rage followed. You, Ezekiel, moved like a man possessed. In one breathless moment, the years melted away. He lunged, disarmed Thomas, and shoved him against the stone wall. Where's Evelyn? He demanded. Thomas grinned, bloody and smug. Gone. Same place your wife ended up. Ezekiel's fist cracked across his jaw. Jonah pulled him back. Zeke, we need him alive if we're going to bring this down. They tied Thomas up, gagged him, and stole away with the notebook, which contained everything, names of buyers, shipments, bribes. It was enough to bury the entire Greaves family. Back in Granger's Hollow, Ezekiel brought the baby to the mission where she'd been kept safe. He cradled her and whispered, your mama was brave. So was your grandma. And now, I know what I have to do. The final act came in the form of justice, not vengeance. With the help of Martha, Jonah, and an honest marshal from downriver, Ezekiel delivered the notebook to a federal agent. Within weeks, headlines across the state read, Ranch Empire topples after decades of corruption. Ward family legacy vindicated. Thomas Greaves was arrested. Several politicians fell, and Clara's name was restored. As for Evelyn, it would take 2 more months before her body was found in a dry ravine south of El Presidio. A silver pendant in her hand, her mother's old ring, and a small cross carved into the rock where she must have scratched it before dying. A final message. For Mama, for justice. Ezekiel wept, not for the first time, but maybe for the last. He brought Evelyn's remains home, buried her beside the empty coffin that once held nothing but lies. And beside it, a third marker, left open for when his time would come. Then he built a cradle, a strong one. He named the child Hope, and the people of Granger's Hollow, who once whispered about the quiet rancher who never smiled, began to say something else entirely, that Ezekiel Ward had finally found his purpose, and that in the arms of a child wearing her grandmother's locket, he had become more than a man alone on the range. He had become a father again.